We have a first of our keynotes here, and I'm very happy to welcome to FSU Laura Wagner. Laura holds a PhD in cultural anthropology from UNC Chapel Hill, where her research focused on displacement, humanitarian aid, and everyday life in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. I'm sure Laura will tell you, but she was in Haiti at the time of the earthquake. She wrote a really nice piece for a book I edited shortly after the earthquake, and we just reread that book in the class I'm teaching. The students really appreciated her sensitivity and insights into everyday Haitian life. From 2015 to 2019, Laura was the project archivist for the Radio IET archive at the Rubinstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Duke University, a really important project. She's currently working on a book manuscript that weaves together her ethnographic research on the earthquake and the materials in the Radio IET archive. So please join me in welcoming to the conference Laura Wagner.
Hi everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. I'll just get started then. Now we'll get started. In Haitian Creole, they say, it's only when the snake has died that you will know its length. 10 years ago, the world convulsed beneath us, and much of Haiti, including the capital city of Port-au-Prince, fell. Each person who disappeared on January 12, 2010, left behind an incalculable void, the depth of which only becomes apparent over the weeks, months, and years after the earth trembled. The earthquake lingers, it reverberates, it never really ends. In the US, when people remember the earthquake at all, they shake their heads and they say, it seems like Haiti just can't catch a break. They wonder, why do bad things keep happening in Haiti? They ask if Haiti has recovered yet. I never know how to answer that question. I say there isn't rubble in the streets anymore. Most people aren't living under tents anymore. But the structural conditions that made the earthquake the disaster it was were centuries in the making, and those have not been changed, those have not been addressed. What I want to say is hundreds of thousands of people died. A city of 3 million people collapsed into a cloud of dust. More than 1 million people were displaced. You don't recover from that. In the US, a lot of people don't think of the earthquake at all. But in Haiti, every single person who survived and every single person who lost someone they loved will think about the earthquake every day for the rest of their lives. Shortly after the earthquake, still in the hospital in Miami, I wrote a piece about what I experienced that day, the one that Martin referred to, when I was buried in the rubble of a collapsed house and rescued by 2 courageous gentlemen who worked for my landlady. In that piece, I tried to make a few points. First, despite everything you've heard, ordinary life does exist in Haiti. Second, despite everything you've heard, Haiti did not descend into chaos at the moment of disaster. The vast majority of people did not respond with looting or violence, and to assume otherwise is racist. Third, most people who were seriously injured and survived, including myself, were saved by ordinary people who reacted to a situation of unimaginable devastation with selflessness and decency. Fourth, any analysis of the earthquake must include the historical and structural factors that created the disaster. I described a woman named Melise who lived and worked in the house where I had rented a room. She was a household worker, a migrant from Haiti's Royal Grandance department who had come to Port-au-Prince in search of a better life for her family. It is a really common story for poor women from the countryside. Melise died on 12 Janvye, crushed to death in a house that was not her own, in a city that was not her home. The story of Melise and her family is a personal and individual story. I want you to know what she experienced and what she longed for. At the same time, her story illustrates how the forces of migration and structural violence bear out over the course of a single life. Her story represents so many of the unnamed and unclaimed victims of 12 Janvye. Many prominent Haitians died in the earthquake: scholars, activists, artists, clergy. You'll find a web page devoted to all the UN employees who died. You'll find articles about the US missionaries and foreign humanitarians who died. But the deaths of most of the Haitian people who died, people like Melise, went unrecorded. Some deaths, like some lives, matter more than others. Mélisse Vivien was the third of 12 children, 10 of whom survived to adulthood. Born to a family of farmers in a village in the mountains of far southwestern Haiti, a community of coconut palms, red dirt, and narrow, rocky paths, where people live off the land and the sea. When conditions are good, they fish for bonito and dive for conch and a marine snail called Ribó. Farmers pull up yams as big as a child, and taro roots from the earth and grow coffee, cacao, and sugarcane. In the summer, there are so many guavas, the children eat them by the handful, or just let them fall to the ground for the pigs to eat. When she was 12, Mélisse's family sent her to Port-au-Prince, where she began working in other people's houses. Many parents in rural Haiti send their children to the city to work as unpaid servants, looking for a better life, for life is precarious in the countryside. Food is free and abundant until a drought or hurricane hits, and when there is no food, people survive with remittances from abroad and supplies from family in the capital. Living and working in Port-au-Prince meant that Mélisse might earn enough money to send her daughter to school and help her extended family in the provinces. The labor of a household worker is backbreaking. Walking up the hills of Port-au-Prince to market every day in the rain or the hot sun, hauling vegetables, plantains, meat, cooking oil, and charcoal in their arms and on their heads, scrubbing clothes by hand in wide basins of water, sweeping and mopping. They clean meat, scrubbing it with salt and sour orange before cooking. They shell beans by hand and remove husks, damaged grains, and pebbles from rice. For this, Mélisse's employer paid her 2,000 Haitian gourd a month, about $50 at the time. In October 2009, the Haitian government mandated a minimum wage of 200 gourd a day, but as Mélisse said, that's for people working in factories, not houses. She thought that when she made a little money, she'd start doing petit commerce instead, participating in the informal sector, selling sundries in the street. People like Mélisse, migrants from rural Haiti, are called moun andeo. To be andeo in a literal sense is to be outside. The pays andeo is the outside country, the land beyond the city, specifically beyond Port-au-Prince. To be a moun andeo is to be a person from the outside land, an outsider. But andeo is not merely a geographical designation. It also means political, social, and economic exclusion. For the last 5 years, as Martin mentioned, I've been creating a trilingual digital archive of Radio Haïti Inter, which was Haiti's most prominent independent radio station. And recently, I've begun to think intentionally about the resonances between the events in the Radio Haiti archive and the earthquake. And while I don't have time to get into all of that today, I thought I would share a clip of Radio Haiti's endlessly charismatic director, Janvye, explaining what andeo means.
There have been two countries for 2 centuries, 2 countries. There was this small country of sophisticated, civilized, quote unquote, going to churches, going to school, speaking French, going to Paris or Harvard or Yale or MIT, doing business, and the rest of the country. The rest of the country, they call the outside country, le pays en dehors. That's meaning the whole situation is in this word, le pays en dehors, the outside country. As if they were the country, and 6 million people were not the country, were outside the country. And those 6 million people, they have been seen as outside, but they saw themselves as outside. When you ask a farmer from Nouvelle-Touraine, where you come from? Outside. Une sorte en dehors. En dehors. En dehors, ça veut dire, en dehors means I'm not inside. I'm not in the cities. I'm not in the school. I'm not in the church. No. I'm in the countryside. I have no road. I I go to Munro, I worship African gods, you worship white God. You speak French, I speak Creole. It's a tale of two countries. Now, the outside countries say, hey, I exist. I am not outside anymore. This country is ours, and I am this country as much as you.
Melis's birth certificate, if she had one, this is not hers, this is just one that I found, would have designated her a paysan from the very start of life. Until 1995, Haitian birth certificates divided people into peasants or city dwellers. So to be a Munandeo was to be an outsider indelibly. Outsiderness and vulnerability are inextricable, and they underlie most ordinary injustices and ordinary preventable deaths. The citizen who must walk 2 hours to vote for candidates that will not represent his interests, the mother who dies in labor because she cannot get to the clinic in the nearest town in time, the child who dies of a burst appendix, the ordinary infection turned to sepsis. To be andeo, to be an outside person from the outside country, is to be beyond any formal safety net. It is to exist in a state of chronic precarity. When life becomes unlivable in the countryside, when farmers can no longer feed their families or pay school fees or hospital bills because the soil has been washed away by rains or winds, or the soil has cracked and grown dry, or the land has been stolen, people are forced to come to the city to chercher la vie, to seek a better life. That's what Melis did. That's what countless people from rural Haiti have done for decades. This continuous forced displacement, because before 1.5 million people were displaced by the earthquake, so many of them were already displaced people, leads to an overpopulated, congested capital, swollen far past the capacity of its infrastructure, filled with fragile cement bidonvilles that wind and sprawl up the hillsides. Port-au-Prince, city of possibility. Port-au-Prince, city of precarity. Port-au-Prince, city of cinder block. Munandeo remain Munandeo in the city. Their outsider status and vulnerability follow them like a shadow. Migrants from rural Haiti to Port-au-Prince remain, for the most part, poor, living in marginalized communities. They sell secondhand clothes or cooked food or phone minutes in the street, working in other people's houses as cooks and housekeepers and drivers, trying to dégager, trying to hustle, trying to survive. Except through extraordinary luck, they lack access to decent healthcare, education, or housing, or rather, they are systematically denied and deprived of those things. Melis was generous and funny. At night, she'd sit on the tile floor in her threadbare white nightgown as French-dubbed Mexican telenovelas flickered across the screen, stories where the wicked are punished while the true-hearted are rewarded for their virtue. Melis dreamed of a life with less anguish. On January 7th, 2010, I came home and found her crying as she peeled yams in the kitchen, imploring God, "Please, Lord, please, l'Éternel." "What's wrong?" I asked. "It's normal to cry from pain," she told me matter-of-factly. "It's prayer that's holding Haiti together. If we didn't pray, Haiti wouldn't even be here. There's too much evil in this world. If we didn't pray, we wouldn't even have Haiti anymore." That was 5 days before the earthquake. She had broken an incisor around Christmas, and for a couple weeks she covered her mouth with her hand whenever she laughed or smiled. "I'm too ugly," she explained, and jokingly called herself a mazora, a toothless person, a worthless person. The morning of January 12th, Melis heated up leftover rice from the night before and scraped her breakfast out of the bottom of the pot. "I'll go to the dentist tomorrow, God willing," she decided, and wiped her hands on her faded housecoat. And that afternoon, the world seemed to end. The earth growled like thunder, it trembled, then bucked. Port-au-Prince was swallowed in a gulp of white dust. The house collapsed. The second floor flattened the first floor, where I was crushed under the ceiling, and the roof fell onto the second floor. The only part of the house to remain intact was the basement, where Melis slept, cooked, and spent much of her day, but that afternoon she was folding clothes up on the second floor. Melis's last words were, "L'Éternel, l'Éternel." As the house fell, she had, again, cried out to God. Disasters do not simply happen to Haiti or anywhere else. Disasters are caused. Hazards are natural phenomena. They become disasters when they encounter existing human vulnerability and inequality. In theory, hurricanes are natural, although with climate change warming the seas, that's leading to bigger and more frequent hurricanes. When a hurricane or anything else hits a populated area, it can be a disaster. And when a disaster strikes, it is almost always the most vulnerable people who suffer the most, whether in a poor country like Haiti or a poor community in a comparatively wealthy country like Flint, Michigan, or the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. We can't talk about the Haiti earthquake without talking about poverty. We can't talk about poverty without talking about power, and we can't talk about power without talking about slavery, imperialism, and colonization. If you ask why the earthquake was the disaster it was, I'd start with Columbus. All these seemingly disparate bad things that have happened to Haiti in the last 10 years, the earthquake, hurricanes, epidemics, political strife, are connected and cumulative, and they all come down to poverty and power. The exceptional moment of crisis is inseparable from ordinary vulnerability. On the eve of the 8th anniversary of the earthquake, as you all know, the white supremacist president of the United States referred to Haiti, El Salvador, and other formerly colonized nations as shithole countries. But Haiti's poverty is neither innate nor natural. In 1804, the Black population of Saint-Domingue overthrew their French enslavers, and Haiti emerged as the first independent Black republic, the mere existence of which threatened a global economic system that depended on the labor and lives of enslaved Black people. The rest of the world never forgave Haiti for becoming free. For more than 200 years, Haiti has been exploited, invaded, occupied, embargoed, evangelized, and intervened upon. This macro-level history, a doleful litany of injustice, leaves out a lot. It illustrates how Haiti came to be the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. It explains what anthropologists like me mean when we say there's no such thing as a natural disaster. But it doesn't tell you what everyday life is like in Haiti. Popular narratives about Haitian suffering preclude the possibility of everyday life in Haiti. But of course, people in Haiti go to work, walk their kids to school, make love, tell jokes, watch telenovelas, write poems, give each other pedicures, argue about politics, send memes via WhatsApp, polish their shoes, worry about their grades, worry about their parents, worry about their children, worry about the future. It's preposterous that describing everyday life in Haiti is a political act, but somehow it is. To insist upon the existence of everyday life is to assert that Haitian people are neither gun-wielding degenerates nor supplicants extending their begging bowls. Life doesn't stop amid chronic crisis. It works its way around the crisis, filling the air like smoke. In the words of Michel Bourdieu, the majority of Haitians live quite ordinary lives. They eat what is, for them, quite ordinary food. They die quite ordinary deaths from quite ordinary accidents, quite ordinary tortures, quite ordinary diseases. Accidents so ordinary they could have been prevented. Tortures so ordinary that the international press does not even mention them. Diseases so ordinary that they are easily treated almost anywhere else. Exceptional, is it? The stories we tell affect policy and shape how governments and other institutions respond to disasters, not only in Haiti, but everywhere. Across the world, across contexts, the people most vulnerable to disasters are also the most misrepresented and maligned, people with the least power to tell their own stories. After Hurricane Katrina, racist ideas about lawlessness and the widespread assumption that societies fall into anarchy at the moment of catastrophe led the US government to respond not by helping victims in New Orleans, most of whom were poor and Black, but instead by mounting a militarized effort to control them. And after the earthquake, the international community's assumptions about the untrustworthiness of the Haitian government and Haitian people contributed to a catastrophic aid response that did not meet the needs of the disaster victims and, in many cases, actively harmed them. After the earthquake, many people declared that the purpose of aid was to make the rich richer, capitalize upon Haitian suffering, and reinforce and justify its own existence. In April 2010, a friend of mine from Cité Soleil explained, "There are a lot of NGOs that know the reality here, but they can't intervene in the way they're supposed to intervene, because they think that if they intervene in the way they're supposed to intervene, there won't be NGOs anymore. NGOs exist because of the problems they're supposed to solve. If they solve them, they won't exist anymore. That's what's broken in this country. They're like a doctor that doesn't cure you, they just keep giving you the wrong medicine in order to keep you sick. That humanitarian and development aid fails to benefit the so-called beneficiaries is not a new claim, but the tension was thrown into sharper relief after the earthquake, when the need was so great, when the promises to save Haiti were so grand, and when the international gaze, however temporarily, pivoted toward Haiti. Sean Penn moved into a tent camp, Beyonce sang Haiti, I can see your halo at the Hope for Haiti telethon. They resurrected the ghost of Michael Jackson to sing a bilingual We Are the World with Wyclef Jean. But Haiti had been the republic of NGOs since long before the earthquake. The streets of Port-au-Prince were clogged with white Land Cruisers before the earthquake. They still are. Safe, decent housing was beyond the reach of most people before the earthquake. It still is. People maneuvered for scarce jobs as household workers and NGO drivers and security guards before the earthquake. They still do. People struggled and schemed to present themselves as deserving aid beneficiaries before the earthquake. They still must. People died in preventable, unjust ways before the earthquake. They still do. People cooked delicious food, embroidered names onto their preschoolers' school uniforms, told jokes, made art, went to church, and poured out rum for the spirits before the earthquake. They still do. The prevailing stereotypes of Haitians as victims or criminals are not all that different. Both views are dehumanizing. Both views exclude the possibility of Haitian people having complex interior lives. A politics of fear is as limiting as a politics of pity. This is true not only in Haiti, it is true of every Black or brown person whose singular life, every song they ever sang their children, every favorite food, every mistake they ever made, every thought they ever had, is reduced to simply part of an undifferentiated, uncountable whole, a dot in a drone strike, a body in a mass grave. Haiti had only just begun rebuilding from a devastating earthquake 6 years ago when Hurricane Matthew tore through the small Caribbean nation. So began a lead story on CNN in October 2016 after the Category 4 storm hit. But the far south of Haiti, the area struck hardest by Hurricane Matthew, was not physically hit by the earthquake, and Port-au-Prince was affected only minimally by the hurricane. The earthquake was largely an urban disaster, while the hurricane swept away small homes and livestock and crops. Yet, to many international news outlets, Haiti might as well not have regions. And so you can see there's Port-au-Prince, and way down there is the Douz. This, too, is a manifestation of the standard media narrative that Haiti, writ large, is organically, inevitably doomed. The earthquake and the hurricane were different in fundamental ways, but I would argue that the two disasters are connected through historical and social patterns of displacement and exclusion. The 2010 earthquake was a disaster because it hit Port-au-Prince, the capital of an over-centralized country, filled with people from the countryside seeking a better life, forced by poverty and circumstance to live in precarious housing. And Hurricane Matthew was a disaster because it hit areas far from Port-au-Prince hardest, far from the capital, far from the aid apparatus and infrastructure, for Haiti is both the Republic of NGOs and the Republic of Port-au-Prince. In other words, the earthquake and the hurricane were manifestations of the same centralization and exclusion. Here's what Hurricane Matthew did in Melise's home community in the seaside mountains of the Douz department. This is how it was narrated to me by the father of my friend Claudine. Claudine's mother, who died in childbirth many years ago, was Melise's sister. When she was a teenager, Claudine had gone to live with Melise, and like so many other people from the countryside, she still lives in the capital. So this is now her father's story. That night, the wind began to blow. All night, Claudine was calling me from Port-au-Prince, telling us to get out of there, to be careful. When she hung up, she told me she'd call me at 3 in the morning. But by 3 o'clock, there was no communication. All the antennas had come down, the wind was blowing. I heard the grapefruit tree break in half, but no one could even stick their head out to see. By 4 a.m., the house started to come apart. The sheet metal peeled away from the roof one by one. My wife, Olene, started to cry. She was holding on to our 6-year-old daughter, Ashkaina, and the other girls were hiding under the table. I took Ashkaina, I shielded her behind my back, and I stood in a corner so that if a piece of wood or sheet metal came at us, it would hit me instead. I made her stand behind my back, and I stood in front of her. I told Olen, "Stop crying, you're an adult. You have to stay strong for the children. You have to resign yourself. Everyone knows it's either life or death, so resign yourself." After a few hours, they thought the worst was over. The wind had calmed, and he ventured outside to check on his mule. But while he was outside, the wind picked up again, and he hurried back to his family. They cowered under the beds and tables as the house blew apart. He said, "Even the dogs were under the table. A piece of meat had fallen on the ground, and the dogs didn't care. When I saw that, that's when I knew we were going to die." They fled, along with perhaps 50 neighbors, to caves in the nearby mountains. He continued, "While we were sitting in the cave, me and Ashkaina, she turned to me and said, 'Papa, we're going to escape. The time for us to die has passed.' I said, 'That's right, my child. We're going to escape. We're not going to die. We're not going to die yet.' Then she asked, 'Papa, can't we go to Port-au-Prince?' I said, 'No, we can't go to Port-au-Prince. All the roads are cut off and there's no way through.' She asked, 'Can't we walk?' And I said, 'Do you think you can walk that far?' And she said, 'You can carry me on your back.' For a small child, the distance between Andeu and Port-au-Prince did not seem so insurmountable. They spent the next 3 days in the cave. On October 5th, one day after the storm, a Haitian artist and cartoonist named Pierre created a poignant image of a broken Haiti, the southern peninsula disconnected from the rest of the country. The southern peninsula is an arm reaching out in desperation, while 4 hands extend from the rest of Haiti, desiring but unable to help. Hurricane Matthew laid bare the tenuous infrastructure that had held Haiti together, if only just barely. With the bridge washed away and cell phone towers down, southern Haiti was cut off. The first days after Hurricane Matthew were like the first days after the earthquake, only in reverse. In Port-au-Prince, people remained in a sickening holding pattern, awaiting news from their loved ones. At first, there was so little news about the conditions in the southern peninsula, I would search social media for any information at all. This meant sifting through some fake news and a good deal more white saviors. The same narratives that circulated after the earthquake surfaced again. Lauding Haitian people for their resilience is racism dressed up as an accolade, as though Black bodies and Black minds and Black souls can take more pain, suffering, and brutality than other people can. A US missionary posted photos on Facebook that showed women with their breasts exposed and an adolescent boy wearing no pants. In one image, which I tried to find and now I can't find, unfortunately, several people run toward the camera, including a child in motion, 1 foot on the ground. Someone has commented, "The smiling amputee reminds me of the earthquake. They have been through so much, and still they rejoice in any gesture." Under that, another person has replied, "I think his leg is behind him. I don't think he's an amputee." There were stark differences in the international media coverage of Hurricane Matthew and that of the earthquake. Because high death counts at the direct moment of impact are more heavily weighted than indirect deaths from hunger, disease, or poverty in the long aftermath. Because the earthquake hit a capital city, so media coverage was immediate from the moment the press hit the tarmac at the airport. Because the earthquake leveled schools, government ministries, hotels, and the UN headquarters, killing rich and poor alike, killing foreigners too. Hurricane Matthew, on the other hand, was the sort of disaster outsiders expect in Haiti. Its effects were perhaps harder to discern because the most affected areas were hard to reach, and even if you did, maybe the devastation didn't look like much unless you knew what the Grands had looked like before the storm. You wouldn't know that the Grands was one of the most fertile parts of the country. After all, Haiti is notoriously denuded, eroded, and poor. In December 2016, 2.5 months after the storm, I went home with Claudine and her cousin Basé. As we traveled from Port-au-Prince along the southern peninsula on a crowded bus, the landscape changed. Palm trees stood lopsided, their fronds gone from the direction the wind had blown. As we went further west, They were bald, like Q-tips, and then even further west, they were ripped out flat on the ground. The Grandas was unrecognizable. Houses that didn't used to be visible through the trees now stood out from miles away. Sometimes they weren't really houses at all, but improvised constructions of tarp, sheet metal, and straw mats. It looked like Port-au-Prince in 2010, a sea of blue and gray tarps, each branded with the name of the agency that had provided them, as if to continually remind the grateful recipient of their good fortune. Patterns of everyday life, like the landscape itself, turned on their heads. Tom tom, long the staple food of the Grandas, became a rarity, a special occasion food. In the months after the storm, breadfruit could only be bought in Port-au-Prince at a steep price and brought back to Jérémie. Breadfruit is what maintained the people of Grandas, a farmer named Dieudonné explained to me. Now, we don't know in what year we'll ever see breadfruit again. The hurricane destroyed everything we had, Dieudonné continued. Now we are living like animals, in the open air, in the rain. All of our livestock, goats, cows, horses, mules, pigs, chickens, they all died. If people managed to buy seeds, plants, or livestock to replace what they lost in the hurricane, the treeless landscape leaves them little shade to plant those seeds or tie up their livestock. Dieudonné explained, it's too much sun, they all burn up. He went on, I don't know how to read. I can't go sit in an office. This is my work. And he showed me his well-used machete caked with dirt. He held it in his hands and said, I'm a farmer. That is how I live. And it's all lost. All the yams are lost. Only the plantain trees have started to grow again. After the hurricane, I tried to plant beans, but the sun was too much and they were all lost too. Even the bananas, if they get too much sun, will die. They'll all die. For those of us of a certain age, me, I was born in 1970, we lost everything we are used to, everything we lived off of. His tone was pragmatic. I might die and never see them again. Maybe my children down the road will be alive when the trees sprout again. Before Matthew struck, their community had experienced a bumper crop. This year, it was as though the breadfruit would never end, recalled Claudine's stepmother Olin wistfully, sitting on a straw mat on her porch as night fell in January 2017. The sky was wider with the tree cover gone. With no ambient light beyond the glow of a flashlight, it sparkled with stars. She took a pinch of powdered tobacco and sniffed, and blew her nose. Breadfruit, coconuts, everyone ate so well. The coconut trees that allowed Claudine's father to provide for his family and send his children to school were destroyed. The chickens and goats all died and were scavenged by dogs. If it weren't for food aid and remittances from abroad, people would have starved. US-grown rice, cornmeal, huge cans of USAID branded cooking oil and beans. Friends from remote areas of the Grandas report that their families never received any manger sinistre at all. Even for those who received them, the distribution of aid vouchers is rarely equitable. In many cases, the vouchers distributed by the municipal government fell into the hands of powerful people who gave them to their supporters, families, and friends. But even when everyone knows that the game is rigged, even when everyone knows that food aid undercuts domestic production, even when people suspect that the NGOs are out for profit, no one can extricate themselves from the aid economy. Matthew is not a name that's familiar to most people in rural Haiti. In Claudine's hometown, they turned the word into something more common, moitié. A moitié is a small, old-fashioned Coca-Cola glass bottle which people used to measure out cooking oil or clairin in the public markets. They called the hurricane moitié, and people joked, moitié ça mesurait pour tout monde joigne. That moitié contained enough for everybody. Everybody got some. Like jokes about the earthquake and cholera, this one had a stinging core of social commentary. Moitié was an equalizing force that destroyed everything in sight. Claudine's cousin Basley took me to meet some of their neighbors, a fisherman named Michel and his wife Marie. Michel cradled his infant son on his lap and described how he lost his dugout canoe in the storm. I would rather have lost my house than my canot, he sighed. because a house is a house and a Keynote is his livelihood, and he lost both. He continued, "We thought we wouldn't live. We had no hope that we would survive. It started around 8 p.m. and it got stronger and stronger all night. By 5 in the morning, it was pounding us over and over. It was destroying all the houses. And we thought we wouldn't survive. We knew a hurricane was coming, but we never imagined it would be that strong." I always say it was God. Why? You see where that mango tree is? It was uprooted, but it didn't fall on the house. You see that breadfruit tree? He gestured. It was uprooted, but it didn't fall on the house. If that wasn't God's power at work, then what was it? What house? I thought to myself. In many cases, the wind ripped away sheet metal roofs while wooden frames remained, but in the case of Michelle's house, the walls crumbled completely, leaving the low metal roof on the ground. They made a hole to serve as the door and stretched a USAID tarp over the top, and that's where their family lived. "I've got a buddy," Michelle continued. "That night when the wind really started to blow, he heard the trees cracking, they were falling on the roof, and he said, 'Ms. Amri, what's going on?' And then he opened the door and he looked outside and he saw a fire coming down on him. And bang, he shut the door. He said he didn't know if anyone else saw it, but there really was a fire in there. That's why so many of the trees burned. They say there really was a fire in it. I saw other trees that were all blackened, every one of them. There was a fire in the storm. There was a product in it that devoured things. They say it's something that the Blanc sent, or else it was God." In Haiti, Blanc means foreigners of any color. "Blanc sent the hurricane?" I asked. "Well, that's what some people say," he replied. "They say Blanc can do that, but then other people say it can't have been the Blanc, because why would they send the hurricane and then bring us food?" My friend Basley laughed. "Well, that's good logic. If the Blanc really wanted to kill us, I don't think they'd be rushing in to bring us food to eat." Michelle nodded. "That's what I always tell people. If the Blanc had done this, if they had sent this hurricane to kill us, they wouldn't then get on airplanes to bring us food. I always say, Blanc wouldn't hate me so much that they'd send this hurricane." He doesn't argue that Blanc are incapable of intentionally creating a hurricane that could rip through the entire Caribbean. He instead asks why they would bother to do that, only to come help afterward. Blanc have the power to destroy or to save. "If it weren't for the Blanc, we all would have gone mad, we all would have died," interjected Marie, Michelle's wife. "Our only hope lies with the Blanc." "Après bon Dieu c'est Blanc," Michelle declared, his baby son babbling on his knees, as we looked out over the sea, where he used to fish, and the wind whipped over the hillside where his house used to be. Foreigners are next to God. Disasters lay bare the vulnerabilities in a society. Disasters make places more susceptible to other disasters, like a house with a cracked and crumbling foundation. What does recovery mean when the disaster never ends? When an earthquake kills a breadwinner and the family can no longer afford hospital fees? When a hurricane washes away a year's worth of crops or fills a basement with toxic black mold? When the power stays off for weeks and insulin goes bad? How do you count the dead? Disasters are caused by poverty and they worsen poverty, and poverty kills people every day. Ordinary deaths by malaria, by hypertension, in childbirth, after the rest of the world has moved on from the initial crisis. Disasters are always political, but so too are ordinary deaths. Disasters can also reveal the decency that lies within individuals and in societies. Ordinary acts of solidarity and reciprocity are transformed by the precarity of life into political acts of survival. I witnessed that decency in the wake of Douz Janvye. I owe my life to it. But that grassroots solidarity begins to fray when states and other institutions intervene. The night of January 12, 2010, the rupture was so unmendable, the devastation so complete, I thought it's certain that things would change in Haiti. Looking back, that sense of certainty appears foolish. It now seems inevitable that the aid response itself would be a disaster, and that Haiti would continue to be destroyed from within and from beyond by the same forces that have been devouring it for centuries. A few days after the earthquake, once I had already been evacuated to the US, A friend of mine, the same friend who told me that NGOs are like doctors who keep you sick, sent me an email with photographs he'd taken in the immediate aftermath. He asked me to get the images out to the world. He thought that maybe people abroad would see the images and send help. I didn't know what to do with those images, some of which were very graphic. Western media outlets rarely afford non-white people from poor places the same privacy or dignity in death as white Americans or Europeans. I didn't believe that my friend's photos of the dead laid out in the streets of Port-au-Prince would move anyone to meaningful action. I feared that the images would be another spectacle of Haitian suffering. And so I did nothing with the photographs, except save them in a folder on my desktop labeled post-quake. Aside from the devastation and death, they show one thing that I keep revisiting: ordinary people rescuing each other. While foreign media concentrated on formal rescue efforts by non-Haitian teams, most of the people who were pulled from the rubble were saved by their friends and neighbors, working with whatever tools they could find. These are the images I return to again and again. These are the truest images I know of Douz Janvye. After Hurricane Matthew, just as after the earthquake, people came together to save what could be saved. I don't think that my own survival on Douz Janvye was simply a question of luck. I believe that the two men who saved my life, both of them migrants from the countryside, had been prepared by a lifetime of having to dégager to ensure their own survival. Beyond the reach of the centralized state, beyond the scope of the centralized NGO apparatus, strategies of survival, collaboration, mutual aid, and reciprocity allowed people to survive the earthquake and the storm, and, however haltingly, to begin to recover. Days before we had news of our friends living on the Southern Peninsula, my friend and colleague Vincent, Joos, and I launched a GoFundMe campaign, which was a very ordinary thing to do. Countless Haitian people in the diaspora and in Port-au-Prince likewise raised money and collected goods, seeds, plants, and livestock for people in the South. Everyone knew that institutional humanitarian aid, whatever form it took, would be unequal to the scale of the disaster. We were astonished to raise more than $20,000 through word of mouth on social media. If Vincent and I were particularly successful, it was because we had established reputations as foreign scholars who had published about Haiti, credibility through whiteness, credibility through Googleability. We split the money. Vincent sent his portion to friends in Chambellan, and I sent mine to Claudine. Within a week of the hurricane, Claudine and Basley brought food from Port-au-Prince, days before any other food aid reached the area. On later trips, they brought sand, sheet metal, rebar, and other building materials, and Basley, who was studying civil engineering, helped his family build stronger, more hurricane-proof homes. We did what we could. The humanitarian question is not whether or not intervening is good or bad. Intervening is not a choice, neither for foreigners who have developed relationships in Haiti, nor for Haitian people who have left to seek a better life abroad. We know that individual acts of charity or patronage are no substitute for governance. Humanitarian action is flawed and imperfect, but it is also an obligation. We act because we must, even though we know that such interventions do not fix the underlying problem and are no substitute for justice. There will be more crises, more emergencies, more losses. Having connections can temporarily transcend the pervasive forces of structural violence, sometimes. We do not need to wonder what happens every day to people who do not have powerful contacts and advocates. When I visited in December 2016 and January 2017, the men and boys of Dejim, that's Claudine's hometown, formed a convite every day to haul heavy coral rocks up from the ocean's edge to build the foundations of the new houses they were erecting. Even a 6-year-old, nicknamed Baby John, participated, carrying a rock balanced on a toquette on his head, holding it with both hands. When they grew tired, the men would sit in Claudine's family's la cour and pass around a bottle of clairin. "Don't give any to Baby John," Claudine admonished. "Et pas garçon lié? Isn't he a man too?" He participated in the corvée, one of the men, named Samuel, replied. Then, chastened, he said, "Not bal nan bouchon. We'll just give him a capful." They passed me the bottle too, though I had carried no rocks, and Samuel wiped his brow. "He is Melisa's cousin." He told me, Lolo, we suffered so much in the storm, that storm Moitié. Many people thought they wouldn't survive because after the storm, they didn't know where to go. There was nothing left. There was nothing left. But, Laura, let me explain something to you. You see, when Claudine came, she brought food for us. The food you sent for us was the first food that saved us. And that's what gave me liberté, égalité, fraternité. Without Claudine, I would never have gotten that food because she divided the food up among all of us. That food saved me. And I salute Claudine's aunt who died too, Melise. I say to Melise, thank you. Claudine has taken Melise's place. I salute Melise in death. Melise's family still feels her absence, but more than that, they feel the effects of her life. She is still there. She is still taking care of her siblings in her village as she did in life when she sent a portion of her wages home each month. The relationships she made and nurtured within her own family and beyond it endure beyond her death. I too am embedded in those relationships. I thought of the earthquake and the storm, 2 disasters 7 years apart, 2 regions, La Ville and Andeo. I thought of everything that binds them together. I thought about the crisis that never seems to end. I thought of Melise. She too lingers. Her life too never ends. Thank you.